A father, not an enemy, not a stranger, stood on a platform and sold his own daughter like a commodity. Evelyn Ashcroft wasn't kidnapped. She wasn't tricked. She was valued by the very man who had given her name. And in a room crammed with wealthy men, no one objected, except for a strange knight feared throughout the frontier. This is the story of a woman sold, a man who refused to buy, and the price both paid for survival. Like if you want to see justice served, comment the name of the city you're viewing from. I want to know how far this story has come. The auction was held on a Thursday, which Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life, not because of the day itself, but because of the smell. Pine resin and cheap tobacco and the particular sourness of men who had ridden hard and hadn't bothered to wash before arriving to bid on a human being. She stood on the loading dock behind Harlan Dodd's feed store, which was the largest covered space in Calder's Crossing that could fit 40 men without anyone having to stand in the sun. The dock had been cleared of its usual burlap sacks and grain barrels. Someone had dragged in a wooden crate and turned it upside down for her to stand on, which she thought was either a practical decision or a deliberate cruelty, and she had stopped being able to tell the difference between those two things several hours ago. Her wrists were not bound. That was the part that kept striking her as strange. She was not chained, not gagged, not restrained in any visible way. She could have stepped off the crate and walked through the back door if she'd wanted to. Except that Deputy Harlow was standing at the back door with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes pointed directly at her, and she had seen Deputy Harlow put 3 fingers of a man's right hand in the dirt over a card dispute the previous spring, so she stayed where she was. Her father stood to her left, slightly behind her, in a position that might have looked protective to someone who didn't understand what was happening. Warren Ashcroft was not a large man. He had never been large. What he had was a quality that Evelyn had spent 22 years trying to name and had finally settled on useful smallness. The ability to make himself appear harmless until the moment he needed something from you, at which point you discovered that the harmlessness had been a performance. He was 51 years old, had the hands of a man who hadn't done physical labor since his 20s, and was currently wearing his good vest, which was a dark brown wool with brass buttons that he reserved for Sundays and transactions he considered significant. He was smiling at the assembled men with the careful smile of someone who had rehearsed it. Evelyn did not look at him. She had made that decision in the wagon on the way over when he had tried to explain his reasoning for the 4th time, and she had realized that if she kept listening, she might do something that would make the situation worse, and the situation was already catastrophic. So she had fixed her eyes on the middle distance and let his words wash over her like creek water over stone, and by the time they arrived, she had managed to construct something inside herself that was not quite calm, but was at least not panic. She was wearing a blue dress she did not particularly like. Her hair was pinned back. She had done these things automatically that morning because she had not yet understood, not fully, what the day was going to be. Now she understood. "Gentlemen," said Warren Ashcroft, stepping forward and spreading his hands in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and promotional. "I appreciate you making the ride out. I know some of you came a considerable distance, and I want you to know that speaks well of you. It speaks to your—" He paused, searching for the word. "Discernment." One of the men near the front, broad-shouldered, red-faced, wearing a rancher's hat with a sweat stain at the band, spat something dark onto the dock floor and said, "Get on with it, Ashcroft." Of course, of course." Warren nodded as if this were reasonable. "My daughter Evelyn, 22 years old. She's been managing our household accounts for the last 3 years, so she's got a head for numbers. She's strong, she doesn't take sick often, and she's— Is she agreeable?" asked a man in the second row. He had a lawyer's voice, precise and uninflected, and Evelyn decided she hated him before she'd seen his face. "She's reasonable," Warren said, with a slight emphasis that was meant to communicate something Evelyn refused to decode. "She understands circumstances." Evelyn's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on the far wall where someone had hung a piece of rope that served no obvious purpose. The men were looking at her the way she had seen men look at horses at auction, calculating, proprietary, running private arithmetic. Some of them she recognized. Rufus Kane, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley and had a reputation for being hard on his workers and harder on his wives, of which he'd had 2 and was apparently in the market for additional arrangements. Marsh Dodd, Harlan's brother, who had money from his silver claim and not much else to recommend him. 3 men she didn't know, who had the look of men who represented other men, proxies for someone with enough wealth to stay invisible. She counted them. It was something to do. There were 41 men in the room, plus Deputy Harlow at the back door, and her father on the dock, and herself on the crate. 44 people in total, and she was the only one whose consent was not a factor in the proceedings. Starting bid, Warren said, with the practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed this many more times than he should have needed to, is $500. The room made a sound. Not quite shock, not quite approval. Something between the two, the specific noise of men recalculating a number they'd already had in their heads. Rufus Kane raised a hand. $550. $600, said one of the proxy men, without looking up from his fingernails. $650, said Kane, with the irritated tone of a man accustomed to winning. Evelyn breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and watched the rope on the far wall and thought about a creek she used to sit beside when she was young, out past the eastern fence line of the Ashcroft property, where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to block the wind. She had spent entire afternoons there as a child, reading whatever she could get her hands on, which was not much but was something. She had been a person who did that. She was trying to hold on to the fact of that person. $700, said someone she couldn't see. Her father's smile widened almost imperceptibly. She was going to be sick. She controlled it. The bidding had reached $820 when the back door opened. Deputy Harlow said, "Hey!" and then said nothing else, which was the first time in Evelyn's memory that Harlow had started a sentence and not finished it. The man who came through the door was not particularly tall. He was lean in the way that suggested the leanness was not natural but earned, the result of years of motion and not enough eating. His hat was pushed back on his head at an angle that was not quite careless. It was too deliberate to be careless. He was wearing a duster that had seen weather, and the leather of his gun belt was worked soft with use. He had a face that had been in wind and sun for so long it was difficult to guess his age precisely. He could have been 35 or 45, and the difference didn't seem to matter to him. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the room. The room looked back. The men nearest to the back shuffled slightly, creating space the way people unconsciously create space around things that might bite. Evelyn had heard of Coulter Vance. Everyone in the territory had heard of Coulter Vance. The stories varied depending on who was telling them and what they wanted you to believe. Bounty hunter, hired gun, former marshal who'd gone bad, former outlaw who'd gone good, a man who worked for money and not causes, a man who worked for causes and not money. None of the stories agreed on the details. They agreed on other things, that he had tracked men across 4 territories and brought back most of them alive, which was considered either a mercy or a message depending on your perspective, that he operated alone and refused partnerships, that he had once walked into a standoff between 2 armed gangs and talked both sides down without drawing his weapon, which either meant he was very persuasive or very terrifying, or both. He looked at the assembled men. He looked at Warren Ashcroft. He looked at Evelyn, standing on her overturned crate in the blue dress she didn't particularly like. His expression did not change, but something shifted in it. A small tightening around the eyes that might have been assessment, or might have been something harder to name. "What's the bid?" he said. His voice was low, not the kind of low that was performed for effect, but the natural low of a man who had learned to make himself heard without raising it. Warren's smile had frozen slightly. "Mr. Vance, didn't expect to see you in Calder's Crossing." $820, said Rufus Kane from the front, answering the question that had been asked and ignoring the one that hadn't. He was watching Vance with the expression of a man doing rapid mental arithmetic. "You joining the bid?" Vance looked at him. "No?" "Then you can leave." "I don't think I will." Harlow had moved away from the door when Vance came through it, and now he was standing with his hand near his hip but not on his gun, which told Evelyn that even Harlow wasn't certain enough to make the first move. "This is a private transaction," Warren said, with the careful voice of a man trying to keep something he's built from falling over. "You weren't invited." "No," Vance agreed. "I wasn't." He had not moved from his position just inside the door. He was looking at the room the way a man looks at a map when he's trying to locate himself on it. How much does he owe? The question dropped into the room's silence and sat there. Warren's face did something complicated. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Your gambling debt to Rufus Kane. Vance said it the way he might say the weather. How much? A sound went through the room, not loud, more like a held breath all releasing at once. Rufus Kane was no longer doing arithmetic. He was doing something else with his face, something that was moving toward anger. That's none of your concern, Vance. You know, it's $940, said Vance, addressing no one in particular, plus interest that Kane has been calculating at a rate that isn't legal in this territory. The principal debt is $460. He paused. The rest is manufactured. You can't walk in here and... Warren started. The debt to Harlan Dodd is $120. Vance continued as if Warren hadn't spoken. The debt to Sheriff Beaumont is $80, which is why the sheriff isn't here today and sent his deputy instead. The debt to at least 2 men I can see in this room, he glanced at the proxy men, represents a network of obligation that has been carefully constructed over approximately 3 years to ensure that Warren Ashcroft has no legal options and no allies, and is therefore willing to do things he might not otherwise consider. Silence. Evelyn, on her crate, had stopped looking at the rope on the far wall. She was looking at Coulter Vance. That's a lie, Warren said. But his voice had lost its shape. He sounded like a man reciting a line he'd practiced, but had lost his confidence in. The documents are at the Regional Land Office in Millhaven, Vance said. They've been there since Tuesday. The telegraph I sent to the Federal Marshal's office in Cheyenne went out yesterday morning. He finally moved one slow step into the room, which caused the nearest men to shift back. So whatever transaction you gentlemen believe you're completing today, you're completing it in the sight of witnesses who are going to be asked to account for themselves within the week. The proxy men in the second row exchanged a look that said something Evelyn couldn't read, but that clearly carried weight, because the one who had been bidding $820 quietly pocketed his hands and seemed to become interested in the middle distance. Rufus Kane had not moved. He was the kind of man, Evelyn understood, who measured everything against his own pride, and right now his pride was losing an argument with his self-preservation. You've got no authority here, Kane said. You're not a lawman. No, Vance agreed. I'm not. He said nothing else, and somehow that was more unsettling than if he'd made a specific threat. The room was doing what rooms do when the air goes out of them. Men were looking at each other, looking at the exits, looking at the calculation they'd come in with, and finding it had changed underneath them. Deputy Harlow cleared his throat. Maybe we ought to... Get out, Vance said. He was still not raising his voice. All of you. Before I start writing down names. 41 men left a room faster than Evelyn would have believed possible. There was shuffling and muttering, and at least one man who knocked over a bucket on his way to the side door, and then there was Rufus Kane, who left last and slowly, the way a man leaves when he wants you to know he's leaving on his own terms, even if that's not entirely accurate. Harlow looked at Vance for a long moment, then looked at Warren Ashcroft, then seemed to reach a private conclusion and walked out through the back without arresting anyone or defending anything. And then there were 3 of them in the feed store dock, Evelyn on her crate, her father beside her, and Coulter Vance standing in the space where 41 men used to be. Warren had recovered some portion of his composure. He straightened his good vest and looked at Vance with the expression of a man trying to reframe a situation in his favor. You've cost me a considerable sum, he said. Vance looked at him without responding. Whatever it is you think you know, I know all of it, Vance said. And in about 4 days, so will a federal marshal. Warren's mouth worked for a moment. Then, with the adaptability of a man who had survived by pivoting, he said, She's still my daughter, under the law. She's 22, Vance said, and she's leaving. Evelyn stepped off the crate. Her legs were steadier than she expected them to be. She looked at her father. He was looking at Vance, not at her, which in some way made everything cleaner. She picked up the shawl that she had set on the crate before being made to stand on it, and she walked toward the back door. She stopped when she was parallel with Vance. He was watching Warren, but she felt that he was also aware of her in the specific way that a man with his training was aware of everything in a room. Did you actually send a telegram to Cheyenne? She asked. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. I did, he said. And the documents in Millhaven? They're there. She nodded once. She was not sure yet what she felt about him. Gratitude seemed insufficient and also possibly premature. But she felt something steady in his presence, not safety exactly, but the suggestion of it. And right now that was more than she'd had in weeks. What happens now? She asked. Vance finally looked at her directly. His eyes were dark gray and direct without being aggressive. The look of a man who had learned to see people accurately because his life sometimes depended on it. That depends on what you want to happen, he said. She thought about the creek with the cottonwoods. She thought about the feel of a book's spine in her hands, the particular pleasure of a problem with a solution. She thought about 41 men looking at her like she was something to be purchased, and what that meant for the version of herself she'd been before this morning. I want to understand what network you were talking about, she said. The one that's been constructing my father's debt. Something moved across Vance's face. Not quite surprise. He had the look of a man who had trained surprise out of himself, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration. That's going to take a while to explain, he said. I have time, she said. I've apparently got nothing else scheduled. They walked out of Harlan Dodd's feed store into the afternoon light of Calder's Crossing, leaving Warren Ashcroft standing on the empty dock beside an overturned crate, his good vest slightly askew, his careful plans scattered across the floor like grain from a torn sack. The town of Calder's Crossing had been established 16 years earlier around a natural spring that made the land good for 100 miles in every direction, which meant it had attracted the kind of men who were good at holding water rights and the kind of men who were good at taking them. By 1883, it had a main street long enough to have 3 saloons and a land registry office that processed more transfers per month than anywhere else in the territory, which told you something if you knew how to read the numbers. Evelyn knew how to read numbers. She had learned young, out of necessity. Her father's relationship with money had always been creative in ways that someone had to track, and as the only member of the Ashcroft household with both the ability and the willingness to do it, the tracking had fallen to her. She had been keeping the family account since she was 16, a fact that had made her useful and, she now understood, made her aware of things that powerful men preferred remained unnoticed. They went to the livery stable at the northern end of town, which was where Vance had his horse. A dark bay with a white sock on its left rear leg, and the patient manner of an animal that had done a great deal of difficult travel and had long since made peace with the fact. Vance didn't say much while he readied the horse. He worked with the efficient movements of a man who had done this so many times that his body knew the sequence without being asked. Evelyn stood to one side and watched him, and thought about the fact that she was standing in a livery stable in Calder's Crossing with a man she'd never met 3 hours ago who had apparently dismantled something her father had spent years building, and she had no clear sense of what was going to happen next, which was terrifying, and also, underneath the terror, something she was not ready to name yet. Why? She said. He looked up from the saddle cinch. You didn't know me, she said. You rode in from... She paused. Where did you ride in from? North, he said. You rode in from the north, went to a livestock dock, and disrupted a transaction involving men who are, from what you described, connected to enough criminal enterprise to be dangerous. For a woman you've never met. She paused. Why? Vance finished checking the cinch and straightened up. He looked at her with the same direct, assessing look he'd given her in the feed store. I've been tracking the network for 8 months, he said. Your father's situation wasn't incidental to it. He was a piece of it. He paused. The auction was... I wasn't expecting the auction. You weren't expecting it, she repeated. I was watching your father because he's connected to Rufus Kane, and Kane is connected to men in Millhaven who are connected to men in Cheyenne who have been running land fraud through this territory for 4 years. He said it carefully, like a man laying out a map. When I understood what the auction was, I understood that if it went through, you'd disappear into someone's household and I'd lose my access to your father's documents. Evelyn processed this. So you needed me? Yes. She appreciated the directness. She was not sure she appreciated everything it implied, but the directness itself she respected. What documents? She said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his duster and removed a folded piece of paper, which he held out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was a land transfer record. Or rather, it was a copy of one written in a hand that was not the official registry's hand. 3 tracts of land, names she half recognized, settlers' names, families who had been in the valley for years and who had, she now saw in writing, transferred their land rights to a corporation called the Consolidated Western Development Company within an 18-month period. She had seen that name before. "This is my father's handwriting," she said. "Yes." She looked at the transfers more carefully, the dates, the amounts, the signatures. And then she saw it the way you see something in a familiar room that has been moved, that wrong-shaped feeling at the back of your perception. The transfer dates all predated the settlement disputes she remembered hearing about at the Calder's Crossing General Store, the ones where families had claimed they'd never signed anything. Except here were the signatures. "These are forged," she said. "I believe so. My father forged land transfers for, she counted quickly, 11 families, and transferred their land to this company." 19 families, Vance said. "Those are 3. She refolded the paper carefully and held it back out to him. He took it. "You said the documents are at the land office in Mill Haven," she said. "Copies. But the originals are at your family's property," he said. "Or were 3 days ago when I confirmed their location." She thought about the house, about the desk in her father's study, which he had always kept locked, and the lock she had never thought to question because he was her father. And there were rooms in your father's house that were his rooms. She thought about the time, 4 years ago, when she had found a key on the floor near the desk and handed it back to him. And he had looked at her with an expression she hadn't understood at the time, a measuring look like he was deciding something. She understood it now. "He's been doing this for 4 years, she said. It wasn't a question. "At minimum," Vance said, "possibly longer." She stood with that for a moment. The livery stable smelled of horses and hay and the specific dust of dry country, and somewhere outside a horse was moving in its stall with the heavy, patient sound of a large animal in a small space. "My father has destroyed 19 families," she said. "More, if you count the downstream effects of the land consolidation." He said it the way he said everything, factual, not inflected with feeling, but somehow not cold either, like he was being careful not to perform emotions he hadn't earned. "And what happens now?" she said. "The federal marshal's office has the telegram. They'll send someone. In the meantime," he paused. "In the meantime, my father will be calculating what he can destroy or conceal before they arrive," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes that saw things accurately. "Yes. And the men from today's transaction, they'll be calculating whether to run or retaliate." "Also, yes. So being in Calder's Crossing is not advisable," he said. She looked at the bay horse, which was watching her with its large, mild eyes. "I need to go back to the house," she said. "That's not—" "The originals are there. You said so." She looked at him. "If my father gets to them first, your copies in Millhaven prove something, but less than they'd prove with the originals. And there are things in that desk that I've never seen, that I didn't know to look for, that might—" She stopped. "He kept other records." "I know he did. He was meticulous about money even when the money was criminal, especially when. He was afraid of being cheated by the men he worked with." She watched Vance absorb this. "If there are records of his dealings with Kane and the others," she said, "records from his side of the transaction rather than the official side, they would be more complete than anything you have. Names, dates, amounts. You can find them." "I can find anything in that house," she said. "I've been maintaining it for 6 years." He was quiet for a moment. "It's going to be watched," he said. "If not tonight, then by morning." "I know the house," she said. "I know every way in and out of it." He looked at her in a way that she was starting to recognize. The same look as in the feed store, when she had asked about the telegram, the recalibration. "We go now," he said. "Before dark." "We," she repeated. "You're not going alone." She thought about pushing back on this and decided against it, not because she couldn't argue the point, but because she was fairly certain he was right, and she was trying to get better at distinguishing between the moments when her independence mattered and the moments when it would just get her killed. "All right," she said. The Ashcroft property was 2 miles east of town, down a road that ran between cottonwood stands, and came out at a low ranch house that had been built for function rather than aesthetics by a man who had arrived in this territory with ambition and had spent the subsequent years diverting it toward increasingly crooked channels. Evelyn had grown up in that house and had done her best to make it livable, which it was, in the same way that a lot of things in her life had been made livable, through consistent effort applied to a situation that was fundamentally not what it appeared to be. They left the horses tied in the cottonwood stand to the north and went in through the kitchen, which faced away from the road. Evelyn had a key. She had always had a key. That was the thing about her father's various calculations. He had always found ways to make her complicit in the maintenance of his life, without telling her what exactly she was maintaining. The house was empty. She could feel its emptiness before she was fully inside, the particular silence of a building with no one home. "He went somewhere after we left," she said quietly. "Or he's waiting," Vance said. She glanced at him. He had his hand near his gun, but not on it, the same posture he'd held in the feed store, ready, but not declaring. "No," she said. "He'll be at the saloon. When things go wrong for him, he drinks first and thinks second. It's a pattern." She moved through the kitchen into the hallway without lighting a lamp, which she didn't need. She had learned the particular dark of this house as a child, and her body still remembered it. Left at the hallway's end, past the door that had always stuck in summer, past the window with the broken latch she had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and there was her father's study. The lock was a good one. He'd replaced it 3 years ago with something from a catalog, heavy and precise. She reached into the pocket of her dress and removed a small iron key. She felt Vance looking at her. "I found it in his coat pocket last winter," she said, "when I was mending it." She paused. "I made a copy." A beat. "Why?" he asked. "I didn't know why at the time," she said. I thought it was the kind of thing I should have. In case." She unlocked the door. "In case of something like this," she supposed. "In case of the morning when you find out that your entire life has been built on a lie, and you need access to the evidence." The desk was a large oak piece, heavy and old, with 3 drawers on the right side and 2 on the left, and a central drawer that was shallow and useless. Warren had always kept the 3 right drawers locked. Evelyn had never had a key to those. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Vance. He was already looking at the drawers. He went to the desk without asking and examined the locks. Cheaper than the door lock, she noticed now, which was interesting and telling and suggested that her father had felt the study itself was sufficient protection. He pulled something from his belt. She didn't look closely at it. And in less than a minute, the upper right drawer was open. She stepped forward and looked. Inside was a ledger. It was a standard issue accounting ledger, the kind sold at any general store. But it was filled with handwriting that was her father's, and numbers that were organized with her father's particular precision. She lifted it carefully and opened it to the first page. The entries went back 5 years. She stood there in the dark study with the ledger open in her hands and read the first page and then the second and then the third. And with each page, the shape of the thing her father had done became clearer and more definite, like a photograph developing in a pan. First vague outlines, then features, then the face that you recognized and didn't want to. Coulter Vance lit a small candle from the desk and held it so she could see better without being asked. "It's all here," she said quietly. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way. Every transaction, names, amounts, his notes on... She turned a page. His notes on the people he dealt with. What leverage he had on them. She paused. What leverage they had on him. "That's what I needed," Vance said. "There's more than you knew about," she said. "Kane isn't the top of this. There are names here I've seen in newspapers. Men in Cheyenne, men in the land office." She looked up at him. "This isn't a local operation." "No," he said. "I know." "How long have you known?" "Long enough." He paused. long enough that I should have moved sooner. But I needed the full picture before I moved, because if I moved too early and missed the upper connections, more families would have lost land, she said. He didn't answer, but his expression acknowledged it. She held the ledger. She thought about the 19 families. She thought about her father standing on the dock with his good vest and his careful smile, selling her like she was a line item in one of his accounting books. And then she thought about the ledger in her hands and what it meant and what it could do. And underneath all of that, she felt something that wasn't revenge and wasn't grief, but was something in the territory between them. A desire for the truth to be visible, to be recorded, to be more permanent than one man's careful plans. We need to take all of it, she said. All of it, he agreed. She put the ledger under her arm and went back to the drawers. The second drawer had correspondence, letters, folded and dated, organized chronologically with the same compulsive neatness that Warren applied to everything. She took those too. The third drawer had something she hadn't expected, a small wooden box, unlocked, containing a collection of papers that turned out to be promissory notes. Not notes her father had given to others, notes that others had given to him. He was lending money, she said. At what rate? She looked at the top note. 18%. That's the same rate as Keynes, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. My father wasn't just in debt to this network, she said slowly. He was part of it. Yes. He was running the same scheme on smaller targets that Kane was running on him. Yes. She put the promissory notes with the correspondence and the ledger. She was building a stack of evidence that was also, she understood, a stack of her father's crimes assembled and organized in her own arms, which was not entirely unlike what she had been doing for years, assembling and organizing his life, except that this time the assembly served someone other than him. She took one last look around the study. In the corner, beneath a blanket she had never thought to look under because it had always been there, she found a tin box. Inside was money. Enough money to tell her that her father had been planning for the possibility that things went wrong and had been making contingency arrangements that did not include her. She took the money too. Not for herself, or not only. She thought of the 19 families and the land they'd lost. Vance was watching her without commenting. When she had everything, she looked at him. Let's go, she said. They left through the kitchen the same way they'd come in. The night had come down while they were inside, and the cottonwood stand was dark, and the horses were patient shapes in the darkness. Evelyn put the documents in the saddlebag that Vance indicated and mounted the horse he'd arranged for her, a roan, steady, not flashy, with the efficiency of a woman who had been riding since she could sit upright. She had lost many things in the last 12 hours. Her home, her father, her illusions about both. The dress she was wearing was not the dress she would have chosen for a night ride into the uncertain territory. But her hands were steady, and her mind was running through the documents she'd seen, cataloging, cross-referencing, identifying what the ledger would prove and what would still need to be established. She was doing the thing she did best, which was understanding the arithmetic of a complicated situation. "Where are we going?" she asked. "East," Vance said. "There's a mining camp abandoned since the strike played out, about 20 miles. No one's out there." "Tonight?" "Tonight." She looked back at the house, the low, functional building she had kept running for 6 years with quiet competence and a set of keys she'd never thought to question. The windows were dark. The door she'd relocked on the way out. She thought of her father somewhere at the saloon, drinking first and thinking second, not yet knowing what she'd taken. She thought of Rufus Kane recalculating. She thought of the proxy men and their quiet eyes. She thought about the ledger with 5 years of evidence in her father's meticulous handwriting, now riding in a saddlebag into the dark. She turned her horse east and rode. The stars were out in force overhead, the particular extravagance of stars in dry country, far from town light. The wind had dropped and the land was quiet around them, sage and rock, and the distant sound of a creek she couldn't see. She was afraid, she acknowledged. She had been afraid since morning, and the fear had changed its shape several times. From the flat terror of the dock, to the controlled tension of the study, to this, which was something sharper and more alert, the fear of a person who is in motion and aware of it. But she was also, underneath it, something that she hadn't been in a long time. She was thinking clearly. She was making decisions. She had taken the ledger and the letters and the promissory notes and the money, and she had understood what they meant, and she had acted, not waited, not deferred to someone else's calculation of what she was worth and what she could or couldn't do. That was not nothing. "Vance," she said. He glanced over from where he rode, slightly ahead and to her left. "The 19 families," she said. "If we can document the fraud clearly enough, if the evidence holds, is it possible to reverse the transfers?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man who doesn't know, but the quiet of a man who is thinking carefully. "Possible," he said. "The land office in Millhaven has the territorial judge's ear. If the case is solid enough—" "What does solid enough look like?" "What you have in that saddlebag, plus witness testimony from at least some of the families who were defrauded, plus the federal involvement I've set in motion." He paused. "And probably your testimony. About what I found in the study. About what you know. All of it." She thought about that. About sitting in front of a judge and accounting for everything she had seen and known and not understood and finally understood. About accounting for her father, which would also mean accounting for herself, for what she had enabled unknowingly, for what she had maintained. It would not be comfortable. It would not be anything like a clean ending. "All right," she said. They rode east into the dark, the land opening up around them like a question they hadn't finished answering yet. The abandoned mining camp at Rattlesnake Flat was not a place that invited comfort. It had been worked hard during the silver boom of the late 70s, and then left with the particular indifference that men apply to things they have used up: collapsed timbers, a rusted sluice frame half swallowed by creosote brush, 3 structures that had once been bunkhouses and were now mostly walls and suggestions of roofs. The spring that had made the location viable still ran, thin and cold, out of a crack in the rock face to the east. Everything else had been stripped or had rotted or had simply given up. Evelyn had not expected comfort. She was past expecting much of anything in the ordinary sense, and had entered a state of focused pragmatism that she recognized dimly as the way her mind handled situations it hadn't been designed for. You stopped wanting things to be different, and you started working with what was in front of you. What was in front of her was a fire that Vance had built low and tight against a surviving section of bunkhouse wall. Enough heat to keep the temperature manageable, not enough light to be visible from the road, and the documents spread across a flat rock between them, and the ledger opened to page 14, which was where the entries became unmistakably criminal rather than merely questionable. She had been reading for 2 hours. Vance had been watching her read. "You're making a list in your head," he said. She looked up. "I make lists. It's how I think." "What's on it?" She looked back at the ledger. "Names I recognize and names I don't. The names I recognize tell me something about the scope of what my father was involved in. The names I don't recognize tell me the scope is bigger than what I can currently verify." She turned a page. "There's a man named Aldous Pruitt mentioned 16 times in the first 2 years of entries. After that, nothing. Either Pruitt left the arrangement or he stopped needing to be mentioned because the arrangement had become routine. Or Pruitt died," Vance said. She looked at him. "There was a man found in the canyon east of Millhaven about 2 years ago," he said. "No identification. The description I heard was consistent with someone who'd been in the territory for a while and had made enemies." He paused. "I don't know that it was Pruitt, but you don't know that it wasn't." "No." She held that thought and then set it aside, the way you set aside something you're not ready to deal with yet when there are more immediate problems. There was a system to working through information under pressure. You sorted by urgency, and you sorted by what could still be changed, and you didn't spend your energy on things that were already finished. "There are land transfers here that don't match the ones your copies document," she said. "Different families. Further north, near the territorial boundary." She held up the ledger so he could see the relevant page. "These are from 3 years ago, if the fraud started up there and moved south." Vance leaned forward and looked at the entries. His expression shifted with the specificity of a man recognizing something. "That's Hargrove territory," he said. "You know it?" "I tracked a man through there 4 years ago. Small settlements, mostly farming families who came up from Colorado. Isolated. He straightened up. If those transfers went through 3 years ago, those families have been living on land they don't legally hold for 3 years and don't know it. Because no one told them. Because the company hasn't moved on it yet. He looked at her. The Consolidated Western Development Company holds the paper. They collect when they're ready, not before. Evelyn thought about that. About families building fences and planting crops and raising children on land that had been stolen from them in writing while they weren't looking. And somewhere in a Cheyenne office or a Millhaven registry, there were documents waiting to fall on them like a wall. How many families total, she said. Your estimate. 35, he said. Possibly 40. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she opened them and looked at the ledger. Then we need everything in this book documented and cross-referenced before your federal marshal arrives, she said. Because if he arrives with copies but not the originals, with a telegraph but not corroborating evidence, the lawyers for the company will have it thrown out before anyone in Cheyenne loses a night's sleep. Vance was quiet. Not the quiet of disagreement. The quiet of a man who had arrived at the same conclusion and wasn't pleased about it. I know, he said. How long do we have? The marshal will need 4 days minimum to make the ride from Cheyenne, assuming he left immediately after the telegraph, which he may not have. Men with authority move on their own schedule. He paused. Kane and his people will be moving faster. How much faster? By tomorrow they'll know the auction failed and why. By the day after, they'll know you're gone and the study was searched. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether they come for us or go for the evidence first. They'd go for the evidence, she said. The documents in Millhaven, the land office, is staffed by a man named Ferris, who I've met exactly once, and whose loyalties I cannot verify, Vance said flatly. I sent the copies there because it was the closest repository I could reach in time. It's not safe. Evelyn looked at him. The fire between them had burned down to mostly coals, and in the reduced light she could see his face more clearly than she had all evening. The tiredness in it, not the theatrical tiredness of complaint, but the deep physical kind. The face of a man who had been running on purpose and not enough sleep for longer than was sustainable. How long have you been working this case? She said. 8 months isn't entirely accurate, he said. It's closer to a year. A year alone. I work alone. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She looked back. Yes, he said. A year alone. She thought about what a year of this would look like, tracking a network of men through 4 territories, building evidence piece by piece, knowing that the evidence had to be comprehensive before you moved, because if you moved too early, they'd scatter and rebuild, and the 35 or 40 families would lose their land anyway. She thought about what kind of person sustains that kind of patience. The kind who has a reason, she thought, but she didn't ask what it was. Not yet. We should sleep in shifts, she said instead. You first. You look like you haven't slept since Tuesday. I haven't slept since Monday. That's worse. She held out her hand. Give me your gun. He looked at her hand, then at her face. I know how to use it, she said. I grew up on a ranch, isolated, with a father who was regularly in debt to dangerous men. I learned to shoot before I learned the capital cities of Europe, which given this evening's events was probably the right priority. A pause. He unholstered the gun and held it out to her, grip first. She took it and checked the cylinder the way she'd been taught, quickly and without making a production of it. 4 hours, she said. Then I wake you. He lay back against the wall without arguing, which told her either that he trusted her judgment or that he was too tired to fight about it, and she suspected it was some proportion of both. She sat with the ledger in her lap and the gun on the rock beside her, and the coals putting out their quiet heat, and she read. She did not sleep in her 4 hours. She told herself she was going to, but she didn't, because the ledger kept delivering new information, and she couldn't make herself stop. There was a quality to reading her father's accounting of his crimes that she could only describe as archaeological. Each entry revealed something below it, some earlier layer of decision and complicity, and she kept digging because she needed to understand the full depth of it before she could begin to think about what came next. By the time she woke Vance, the sky to the east was going gray at the edges, and she had a complete mental map of every transaction in the first 4 years of entries and a working theory about the structure of the Consolidated Western Development Company that she thought was probably right but needed verification. Vance woke the way she imagined he always woke, fast and fully, hand reaching before he was entirely conscious. She had moved the gun before he could reach it. "Good morning," she said. He looked at the gray sky, then at her. "You didn't sleep. I need to tell you what I found." He sat up and rubbed his face with both hands, an unguarded human gesture that was the most undefended thing she'd seen him do, and said, "Start from the most urgent part." "The company isn't registered in Wyoming territory," she said. "The entries reference a registration in Missouri, which means the fraud was structured across state and territorial lines deliberately to complicate jurisdiction." He lowered his hands and looked at her. "My father's notes mention a man he calls HF 11 times in the second and third years. In year 4, HF becomes Mr. Harlan Fletcher." She watched his face. "That name means something to you." "Harlan Fletcher," he said, with the careful enunciation of a man tasting something he expected to taste. "He's a land development attorney in Cheyenne. Legitimate practice, prominent clients," he paused. "He also sat on the Territorial Land Commission for 2 years. Then he would have had direct access to the registry records," she said. "Yes, and the ability to make fraudulent transfers appear legitimate at the source." "Yes." He stood up. He was moving already, thinking through implications. She could see it in the particular quality of his stillness, the kind of stillness that is actually rapid internal motion. If Fletcher is HF, that's not a middle connection. That's near the top. "There's more," she said. "In year 3, my father made payments to a man he refers to only as the deputy, different from the payments to Harlow. These are larger amounts, quarterly, and they're annotated with the initials BC. Vance turned and looked at her directly. "BC. You know who that is." "It could be several people." "It could," she agreed, "but you already have a guess, and from the look on your face, it's not a comfortable one." He was quiet for a moment. The sky had lightened enough that she could see his face clearly, the particular expression of a man confronting something he'd suspected and hoped was wrong. "Buck Connolly," he said. "He's a deputy U.S. Marshal out of the Cheyenne office." The weight of that settled between them. "If a federal marshal's deputy is on the payroll," she said, "then the telegram you sent may have gone to a sympathetic recipient," he said, "or may have been flagged before it reached anyone I'd want it to reach." He said it the way he said most things, level, factual, without panic, but she could hear what was underneath it. 8 months of careful work, and the channel he'd used to set it in motion might have a hole in it. "Can you reach someone else?" she asked. "There's a judge in Millhaven. Territorial, not federal. His name is Arbuckle, and I don't know that he's clean, but I have no evidence he's not, and at this point that's the best I can say about most people." "A territorial judge can't override a federal investigation," she said. "No. But he can issue warrants. He can make things official in ways that are harder to quietly make unofficial." He looked at her. "And he's a 3-hour ride from here, which Cheyenne is not." "Then we need to go to Millhaven." "Through Calder's Crossing." "Through—" She paused. "No, we can go around. The Canyon Road east of the Henderson property comes out 2 miles south of Millhaven. It adds 4 hours, but it avoids the main road." He looked at her. "I told you," she said. "I know this land." The Canyon Road was not a road in any charitable sense. It was a track that existed because wagons had occasionally used it when the main road flooded, and it was narrow and uneven, and at one point required them to dismount and lead the horses down a section of loose shale that neither animal was enthusiastic about. But it avoided Calder's Crossing and the 2 roads out of it that Vance had reason to be cautious about, and by mid-morning they were in scrubland country 6 miles east of the main route. They were a mile from the canyon's end when they found the wagon. It was sitting at an angle off the track, one wheel sunk into a rut, the horse attached to it standing with the philosophical patience of an animal that has decided the humans will sort themselves out eventually. In the wagon were a woman, approximately 50 years old, and 2 children who were probably 12 and 9, and the woman had a shotgun across her knees that she was pointing at them with the competent steadiness of someone who had aimed at things before. Vance stopped his horse. "Morning," he said. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am." He put both hands on the saddle horn, which was not a casual gesture. It was specific and deliberate, the gesture of a man who understood that it needed to be visible. Evelyn came to a stop beside him and did the same. The woman's eyes moved between them. She had a weathered face, a strong jaw, and the expression of someone who had been frightened recently and had converted the fright into something more useful. "Where are you headed?" the woman asked. "Millhaven," Vance said. "Which way'd you come from?" "Canyon Road from the west." She processed this. "You came through the canyon?" "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't come through Calder's Crossing?" "No." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, nothing that fast, but a slight recalculation. She didn't lower the shotgun. "Were you at the Hennessy place last night?" she asked. Vance looked at her steadily. "No." "Why?" "Because someone was." Her jaw tightened. "Someone went through the Hennessy place last night and told Mabel Hennessy that the men who hold their land papers were coming to collect, told her to get out before morning." She paused. "We're the Callahans. We farm 8 miles east of Hennessy. I got Mabel's boy at my door at 4 in the morning with that story, and I'm not going to, She stopped. "I'm not sitting in my house waiting to find out if it's true." Evelyn looked at Vance. He looked at her. "Mrs. Callahan," Evelyn said carefully. "Miss?" the woman said. "Callahan." "Miss Callahan, how long have you had your land papers?" 6 years. Why?" "What name is on them?" "On the originating deed." A pause. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because there's a chance your deed has been transferred without your knowledge, to a company called the Consolidated Western Development Company." The shotgun didn't move, but something behind the woman's eyes did. A recognition, or more precisely the kind of recognition that is also a confirmation of something you'd been afraid might be true. "Arthur Hennessy said something like that," she said slowly. "Last month. Said he'd heard talk at the feed store about people who'd sold their land and didn't know it. I thought he was—" She stopped. "He wasn't," Vance said. "It's not a rumor." "How do you know?" Vance looked at Evelyn. A question. "Do you want to explain it, or should I?" She answered it herself. "Because I have the documents," she said. "In my saddlebag. I can show you if you'd like. I should warn you it won't be pleasant reading." Miss Callahan looked at her for a long moment. The children behind her were very quiet. Then, slowly, she lowered the shotgun to a position that was not exactly trusting, but was no longer pointed at anything. "Pull over there," she said, nodding at a flat section beside the track. "We're not doing this in the middle of a road." Her name was Clara Callahan. She had come to the territory 11 years ago with a husband who had died of fever 3 years in, and she had stayed because she'd already broken ground and because going back east meant admitting defeat, and she was not constituted for defeat. She had worked the land herself and hired seasonal help when she could afford it and raised her 2 children. The 12-year-old was a girl named Iris. The 9-year-old was a boy named Dub, whose given name was Douglas, but who had resisted it from infancy. She read the ledger entries pertaining to the northern settlements with the focused attention of a woman who had done her own bookkeeping for 11 years and understood what she was looking at. Her expression throughout was controlled, which Evelyn had come to recognize as the specific control of a person managing a very large emotion in front of strangers. "This is my name," Clara said. She was pointing at an entry in year 3 of the ledger. "C. Callahan, Lot 7, Northern Section. That's my lot." "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's not my signature." "No, it's not." Clara looked at the entry for another long moment. Dub had leaned over from the wagon seat to see what his mother was reading, and she had pushed him gently back without looking at him, the automatic gesture of a parent doing something serious. "So I don't own it," Clara said. "Not on paper," Vance said. "But the transfer was fraudulent, which means it can potentially be reversed." "Potentially?" She said the word like it tasted like something. "If the case goes before a judge with the full evidence, yes," Evelyn said. Potentially is the honest word. I won't tell you it's certain. Clara looked at her directly. Most people who want something from me start with the certain. I'm not trying to get anything from you, Evelyn said. I'm trying to get to Millhaven with this evidence before the men who did this realize what I'm carrying. A silence. The horses shifted. Iris, the 12-year-old, was watching Evelyn with the particular focused attention of a child doing rapid assessment of an adult. The Hennessy boys said there were men on the road last night, Clara said, coming from Calder's Crossing direction. Vance looked at her. How many? He said 5 or 6 horses, moving fast. Evelyn looked at Vance. He was doing the same calculation she was. 5 or 6 men moving fast from Calder's Crossing the night after an auction that had gone badly wrong was not a coincidence. They'll be on the main road, he said. It was unclear whether this was reassurance or just a fact. Possibly both. Unless they know about the canyon road, Evelyn said. They might. Then we're not safe staying still, she said. Clara had been watching this exchange. You're running from these men. Yes, Evelyn said, and you're going to Millhaven to do something about them. Yes? And the thing you're going to do, if it works, that's the thing that gets my land back. Evelyn looked at her. If it works, yes. Clara was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. Then she clicked her tongue at her horse and began to turn the wagon, which was a complicated operation in a narrow track and required backing and pulling and a certain amount of muttering. When she had it facing the right direction, she looked at them. The Hennessy farm is 4 miles back, she said. There's a woman there and 5 children, and she doesn't know what to do, and I'm not leaving her there with those men on the road. She paused. But I know another way into Millhaven. Longer, nobody uses it. Evelyn looked at Vance. We're listening, he said. You follow me, Clara said. You don't get ahead of me and you don't fall behind. And when we get to Millhaven, whatever you're going to do, you do it fast because I've got 2 children and I'm not in the business of being in the middle of something. Understood, Vance said. And one more thing. Clara looked at Evelyn specifically, the way she had looked at the ledger, carefully, assessing. You said you have documents, copies or originals? Originals, Evelyn said. Something went through Clara Callahan's face that was not quite relief, but was its close neighbor. Then let's go, she said. Son. The route Clara knew added 3 hours and went through country that was not on any map Evelyn had ever seen. A dry wash that turned out to be navigable for horses and wagon. If you knew where the soft spots were, a ridge crossing that required dismounting but gave them a sight line for miles in 3 directions. And finally, a back approach to Millhaven that came in through the stockyards on the southern end of town and smelled aggressively of cattle. They arrived at mid-afternoon. Evelyn had spent the hours of writing, sorting, and cataloging and preparing what she was going to say, the way she had once prepared account presentations for her father, methodically, in order of importance, thinking about the questions that would be asked and what answers would satisfy them. She was doing this, she recognized, partly because it was her nature, and partly because the preparation kept her from thinking about other things, about her father at the saloon, about the shape of what she'd found in that desk. Vance had ridden mostly in silence beside her. Once, when the dry wash narrowed and they had to go single file, he had dropped back and let her lead, which was either practical, she was following Clara, or it was something else. She didn't analyze it. The judge's office in Millhaven was on the 2nd floor of a building that also housed the land registry and a notary, which was an arrangement that had probably seemed efficient and now felt, to Evelyn, uncomfortably symbolic. The registry was on the ground floor. She thought about the copies Vance had sent and what might have happened to them and kept climbing the stairs. Judge Arbuckle was a large man with a large desk and the white whiskers of a man who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of his whiskers. He was eating a late lunch when they came in, bread and something from a tin. And he did not look pleased about the interruption, but he did not send them away, which Evelyn chose to interpret as promising. Vance, he said, with the tone of a man greeting someone he knows by reputation and had hoped not to encounter personally. Sit down. This is Evelyn Ashcroft, Vance said. I know who she is, Arbuckle said, which surprised her. Word travels from Calder's Crossing faster than you'd think. Sit down, both of you. He looked at the saddlebag in her arms. Is that what I think it is? That depends on what you think it is, she said. He looked at her with the slightly appraising expression of a man recalibrating. Warren Ashcroft's records. His ledger and correspondence, yes. Original documents. She set the bag on the edge of his desk. I also have a theory about the corporate structure of the Consolidated Western Development Company that I'd like to walk you through because I think it bears directly on jurisdiction. Arbuckle looked at Vance. She's going to tell me how to do my job. Probably, Vance said. Fine. He pushed his lunch aside. Show me. She opened the ledger. They were in Arbuckle's office for 2 hours. Evelyn talked for most of it, which was not something she would have predicted of herself 3 days ago, but which now felt as natural as breathing. She had the information, she had organized it, and there was a judge in front of her with the power to do something with it. And every minute she spent being cautious was a minute the men on horseback from Calder's Crossing were spending moving. Arbuckle asked good questions. She was glad of that. She had been half afraid he would be the kind of official who listened with the performance of attention while actually calculating how this affected him, but he asked precise, substantive questions about dates and transfer mechanisms and the Missouri registration and the relationship between Harlan Fletcher and the commission records. He wrote things down in a cramped, fast hand that suggested genuine engagement. Vance contributed specific things, the traceable movement of men between territories, the pattern of intimidation he'd documented, the connection to the unidentified body in the canyon. He was spare with words, and what he said was precise, and Evelyn noticed that he never said anything he couldn't verify, which meant he sometimes stopped mid-thought and said simply, "I can't confirm that," and went no further. She appreciated that. At the end of it, Arbuckle sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "I can issue warrants for Warren Ashcroft and Rufus Kane today," he said. "If I include the evidence standard correctly, that covers the immediate criminal exposure." He paused. "Fletcher is different. He's in Cheyenne. Territorial warrant isn't clean on a Cheyenne resident who may have federal connections." "The federal connection is the problem," Vance said. He told Arbuckle about BC and the deputy U.S. Marshal. Arbuckle's expression, throughout, was the expression of a man who has heard bad news before and has stopped expecting it not to happen. "All right," Arbuckle said. "The question of whom in the Cheyenne Marshal's office is compromised is above my authority and, frankly, above my pay grade. What I can do," he reached for his pen, "is write directly to the district court in Denver. I know Judge Pierce personally. He is not above his pay grade." "How long for a response?" Evelyn asked. "A week. Maybe 10 days. And in the meantime," Arbuckle looked at her, "in the meantime, you are in possession of original documents that several dangerous men very much want recovered, which means you have a problem that warrants—" He paused, seeming to find this slightly unfortunate, "don't entirely solve." "No," she agreed, "they don't." Outside the window of Arbuckle's office, Millhaven was going about its late afternoon business. Wagons on the main street, men moving between the storefronts, the ordinary friction of a functioning town. From 2 floors up, it looked peaceful. She was aware that peaceful and safe were not the same thing. "There's something else," she said. Both men looked at her. "The families," she said. "The ones whose land was fraudulently transferred. They don't know about the warrants. They don't know about any of this. Some of them," she thought of Clara Callahan's name in the ledger, of the Hennessy farm with the 5 children. "Some of them may already have men arriving at their doors." Arbuckle frowned. "I can't dispatch." "I'm not asking you to dispatch anyone," she said. "I'm asking whether there's a legal mechanism to notify them, to make them aware that their transfer documents are under challenge, so that if someone shows up claiming legal title, they have grounds to dispute it immediately rather than just," she paused, "just letting themselves be moved off land they've worked for years because a piece of paper says they should." Arbuckle was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, people doing rapid revision of their initial read of her. "I can issue a general notice of challenge," he said slowly. "Posted in the registry. It's not ironclad, but it creates a legal record that the transfers are in dispute." He paused. It also makes this very public. Good, she said. Vance looked at her. If it's public, she said, then the men collecting on those transfers have to contend with public knowledge. They can't move quietly. Every action they take becomes visible. She looked at Arbuckle. Can you do it today? He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his pen. It's an unusual procedure, he said. Yes, she said. It probably is. She watched him write and thought about 35 families, maybe 40, and the specific quality of not knowing that something was being done, the way you could live inside a crisis without the knowledge of the people working on the edges of it. She thought about a creek with cottonwoods and a girl who had sat beside it with books, and how that girl would have never predicted this room, this desk, this weight of documents in a saddlebag. Vance was standing near the window, watching the street below. His posture had shifted since they came inside. Something tighter in the way he held himself. The specific alertness of a man who had let his guard down slightly in a relatively safe room and was now recalibrating because they were going to have to go back outside. She understood why. They were not done. They were not close to done. The warrants would help, but they would also accelerate things. Men who were being hunted moved differently than men who felt secure, and moved faster, and sometimes in ways you couldn't predict. Her father was somewhere in this. Still moving, still calculating, and she didn't know yet how that calculation was going to land. But she had the ledger, she had the correspondence, she had a judge writing warrants and a notice of challenge going on the registry, and a territorial judge in Mill Haven who was writing to a man in Denver who was not above his pay grade. It was not clean. It was not close to finished. There were pieces moving that she couldn't see from where she was standing. But she was standing, which was something she had not been entirely sure of 12 hours ago, and she had a plan with more structure than she'd had when she left that dock in Calder's Crossing, and she was moving forward instead of being moved. For now, that was what she had. Arbuckle's notice went on the registry board at 4:30, hand-lettered on official paper and signed with his seal, and by 5 o'clock, 3 different men had read it, and 2 of them had left town in a hurry, which told Evelyn something about how thoroughly the network had embedded itself into the ordinary business of Mill Haven. She watched from the window of the room above the dry goods store that Vance had arranged. $2 for the night, paid in cash, no names recorded, the kind of transaction that the store's owner was clearly familiar with and did not find remarkable. The room smelled of dust and dried beans from the storeroom below, and the window faced the main street at an angle that let her see the registry building without being directly visible from it. Vance came back from wherever he'd been and stood beside her at the window. "The copies I sent are gone," he said. She looked at him. "Ferris, the land registry clerk. He's not here. His assistant says he left this morning for a family emergency." He said it with the flat inflection of a man who has encountered this kind of coincidence before and has stopped being surprised by it. The copies were in a locked drawer in his office. "The drawer is empty." She turned back to the window. "So they knew before we got here." "They knew before yesterday," he said, "which means someone in Cheyenne moved faster than I anticipated." "Fletcher." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "The telegram may have been enough to tell them what I had and where I'd sent it. I should have been less specific." She heard something in that, not quite self-recrimination, but its functional cousin, the retrospective accounting of a man who ran his own operations and therefore had no one else to assign the errors to. She recognized it because she did the same thing. "The originals are still here," she said, "with Arbuckle." "They're with Arbuckle," he agreed, "who is one man in a second-floor office." She understood what he didn't say. Arbuckle had issued the warrants and written to Denver and posted the notice, and all of that was real and would matter in time, but time was the variable they didn't have much of. A notice on a registry board was paper. Warrants were paper. The men who had ridden out of Calder's Crossing the night before were not paper. "How many men does Kane have?" she asked. "Employed or available to him?" "Available." "In this territory? 8 to 12, depending on who he's willing to call in." He paused. "He'll call them all in now." She thought about the fort. The outline of the plan had been forming in her mind since somewhere in the dry wash, assembling itself from pieces the way her accounting worked. You put the numbers in order and the structure emerged. She hadn't said it out loud yet because she'd been waiting until she understood its full shape, And now she did, and she also understood that Vance was not going to like it. "I want to go back to Calder's Crossing," she said. The silence that followed had a specific quality. "No," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she said. "Not sharp." She kept her voice level because she didn't need this to be a fight. She needed it to be a conversation that ended with him understanding. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do and why, and then you can tell me what's wrong with it." He looked at her. "Kane needs to collect on the land transfers before the Denver court responds to Arbuckle's letter," she said. "That's his timeline. He can't move openly on 35 families while there's an active challenge in the registry, not without creating the kind of legal exposure that even a compromised deputy marshal can't contain. So he needs to move on the evidence first." She paused. "The original documents are here, which means he'll come here. Or he'll move on my father, who is the weakest piece of the network right now and the most likely to make a deal." "And you want to put yourself in the middle of that," he said. "I want to control where it happens," she said. "Right now, everything is scattered. Arbuckle in his office, us in this room, Clara Callahan on the road, my father at whatever saloon he's found. Kane's people can move on any of those separately, quietly, and pick them apart one at a time." She looked at him steadily. "But if I go back to Calder's Crossing, if I walk in visibly, publicly, and announce that I'm offering myself as the central point of negotiation, they'll come to me instead of hunting everyone else separately." "That's the plan," he said. "You as bait." "I prefer to think of it as controlling the terrain," she said. "It's the same thing." "Yes," she said, "it is. But terrain matters. Right now they pick the ground. I want to pick it." He walked to the other side of the room and back, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was working through something he didn't want to simply react to. He had more self-discipline than most men she'd met, which in this moment was useful because it meant she was going to get a real argument rather than a reflexive one. "The fort at Calder's Crossing," he said. "You're thinking the fort." She was slightly surprised. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it's a known structure with defined entry points that I've walked through enough times to map from memory. Because it was abandoned by the cavalry 3 years ago, and the town uses it for storage, which means it's publicly accessible and not controlled by Kane or anyone directly aligned with him." She paused. "And because an auction held at a fort carries a different quality than one held at a feed store dock. More visible, more official feeling, the kind of thing that draws the men who want to see the conclusion of something rather than just collecting their portion quietly." He was looking at her with the recalibrating expression. She was getting used to it. "You want to stage a second auction," he said. "I want to use the appearance of one. The announcement, the invitation, the formal setting." She met his eyes. "While you prepare the fort for what's actually going to happen." "Which is?" "Evidence, witnesses, Arbuckle, if he'll come. The families, at least the ones we can reach in time. All of it in one place, in front of everyone." She paused. "You make it a trap for them. I make it look like a surrender." He was quiet for long enough that she heard a wagon pass in the street below and someone arguing in the building next door about the price of something. "You'd go in alone," he said. "Yes." "Into a room with Rufus Kane and his men and your father and whatever hired guns Kane's called in." He said it without inflection, but the weight of it was in the room. "I'll have Arbuckle's warrant papers," she said, "and the notice of challenge, and the understanding that every man in that room will know they're being documented because that's the point. The documentation is the weapon." "Documentation doesn't stop a bullet, Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed it without commenting on it. "No," she said. "It doesn't. That's why you need to be there before I arrive." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" Another long silence. "The access point on the fort's north wall," he said slowly. "The section the cavalry bricked up before they left. There's a gap at the foundation level. A man can get through it if he's not too large." "I know the gap," she said. "I used to dare boys to crawl through it when I was 12. Something crossed his face that might, under different circumstances, have been amusement. "I need a day," he said. "Maybe a day and a half. To reach the families we can reach, to get Arbuckle positioned, to set up the fort. Then I send the invitation tomorrow morning and arrive the following afternoon," she said. "That gives you a day and a half." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without filling it. "You've thought about the things that go wrong," he said. "I've thought about several of them," she said. "I haven't stopped." "Your father," he said. "You don't know how he'll react when he sees you." She had thought about this the most. She had thought about it since the study, since the desk, since the ledger opened to the first page and the shape of what she'd seen there. The 5 years of meticulous record-keeping, the handwriting she'd grown up watching form letters on grocery lists and property notices. She'd thought about it in the dry wash and through the canyon and sitting in Arbuckle's office, and she still didn't have an answer she was fully satisfied with. "I know some things about how he responds under pressure," she said carefully. "I've had 22 years of observing it. He's calculating. He'll be looking for an angle even in the room, and when he sees that there is no angle—" She stopped. "What happens then?" "I don't know," she said. "I genuinely don't know. That's the part I can't map in advance." He nodded, like that honesty was the right answer. "Get some sleep," he said. "We write the invitation in the morning." She slept 4 hours and dreamed about nothing she remembered, which felt like its own kind of mercy. In the morning, she wrote the letter at the small table near the window while Vance watched the street and the light came in at a low angle and turned the dust motes gold. The letter was addressed to Rufus Kane. She had thought about addressing it to her father and decided against it. Her father was a mechanism in this structure, but not the one with decision-making authority, and Kane needed to feel that this was being offered to him specifically, that she had chosen to deal with him because she recognized where the actual power lay. She wrote it twice. The first draft was too formal, too careful. She tore it up and wrote it in her natural voice, which was direct and organized and did not waste words. "Mr. Kane, the auction at Dodd's feed store was interrupted before its conclusion. I am prepared to return to Calder's Crossing the day after tomorrow and complete the transaction in a setting appropriate to its actual scope. I suggest the old cavalry fort at the eastern edge of town, which has the space to accommodate everyone with an interest in this matter's resolution. I ask only that the principals be present, yourself, the relevant parties from Millhaven and Cheyenne, and my father. I have the documents you're looking for. I am prepared to discuss arrangements. E. Ashcroft." She held it up and read it. "Too much," Vance said, reading over her shoulder. The line about the documents. "It needs to be there," she said. "That's what brings Fletcher's people. If Kane thinks this is just about me, he'll send 2 men to collect me and not show up himself. But if he thinks I have something he needs and I'm willing to deal—" "He comes in person," Vance said, "and he brings the others." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he paused. "The line about Millhaven and Cheyenne. He'll know that's Fletcher you're referencing." "Yes," she said. "I want him to know I know about Fletcher. That tells him this isn't a panicked woman looking to negotiate her way out of a bad situation. It tells him I have a full picture. That might make him more careful. Or it might make him feel that careful isn't an option anymore," she said. "That the only way to contain this is to end it, and the only way to end it is to be in the room when it happens." She looked at the letter. "He's the kind of man who needs to see things finished. I've watched him operate. He doesn't delegate the things that matter to him." Vance looked at the letter for another moment, then, "Send it." They found a courier, a boy who made deliveries between Millhaven and the surrounding towns and who was completely uninterested in the contents of what he carried, which was the primary qualification. She paid him well and watched him ride out toward Calder's Crossing and felt the particular finality of a thing set in motion. Then she went to find Clara Callahan. Clara was at the boarding house on Millhaven's south end, where she'd taken Dub and Iris the night before, after arriving in town with Evelyn and Vance. The children were in the small yard behind the boarding house doing something with a length of rope that seemed to involve no coordination and a great deal of disagreement. Clara was on the back step drinking coffee and watching them with the expression of a woman who had sat with large problems long enough to develop a relationship with them. She looked up when Evelyn came around the corner. "You're about to ask me something," Clara said. Evelyn sat on the step beside her. "The Hennessy family, and whatever other families you know who are affected, I need someone to reach them." "And tell them what?" "That there's going to be a gathering at the fort in Calder's Crossing the day after tomorrow, that it concerns their land and they have a right to be present." She paused. I can't promise anything. I won't promise what I'm not certain of. But if it goes the way you want it to go, if it goes the way I want it to go, they'll see, in front of their own eyes, the men who took their land identified and held accountable, and they'll be witnesses, which matters for the legal proceedings after. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. In the yard, Dub had apparently won the rope argument and was demonstrating something that required waving it in circles, which Iris was watching with studied unimpression. I don't know if I can reach many of them in a day, Clara said. Whoever you can reach, Evelyn said. And Clara, she paused. I should tell you, I don't know exactly what's going to happen at that fort. I have a plan, but plans have gaps in them. It may not be safe. Clara looked at hers with a look that was dry in the way of a woman who had been in this territory for 11 years. I'm a widowed woman farming 8 miles from anyone on land I don't actually own, she said. Define safe for me. Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. I'll reach who I can, Clara said. You do your part. Vance left that afternoon. He didn't say a great deal before he went. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who expressed things through words if another method was available. He went over the plan once more with her, walked through the specific timing, identified the 2 places where the timing was most likely to fail, and what she should do if they did. He had given her a knife the previous evening, not his gun. You can't walk into that room with a visible weapon, he'd said, but you can walk out of almost anything with a knife if you keep your head. She had accepted the knife and said nothing about the fact that she had her father's money in the lining of her saddlebag, which she had divided into 2 portions for reasons she wasn't ready to explain yet. At the stable, before he mounted, he said, If something goes wrong before I'm in position, I'll know, she said. How? Because you won't be there, she said, and if you're not there, I'll adjust. He looked at her for a moment. Don't let your father talk you out of something once you're in the room. I'm not worried about that, she said. I am, he said. Slightly. He's been talking me into and out of things my whole life, she said. I know his methods. She paused. I know exactly where each of them stops working. He held her look for a moment longer. Then he mounted and rode north, and she watched him go until the road bent, and he was gone. The day she had before leaving for Calder's Crossing was the longest day she could remember in recent history, which was saying something given what the preceding days had contained. She spent the morning with Arbuckle, going through the warrant documents and preparing a summary of the key evidence in the ledger that could be presented quickly and clearly. She thought about it as the version of the evidence that could be understood by someone who hadn't spent 2 days living inside it. Clean lines, clear connections, no assumptions. Arbuckle was resistant to coming to the fort personally. I'm a judge, he said, not a sheriff. You issued the warrants, she said. If the men named in those warrants are in that room, you have the authority to execute them. I have a marshal for that. Your marshal may be compromised, she said. We've discussed this. I could deputize someone. Who? She asked. She waited. He didn't have an immediate answer. Judge. The system that's supposed to make this function correctly has a leak in it at the federal level. The territorial level is what we have. You're what we have. She paused. I'm not trying to put you in a dangerous position. Vance will have men in that fort before I arrive. Your job is to be present and visible, and to have the warrants in your hand when the moment comes. Arbuckle looked at the ceiling for a while. I'm 63 years old, he said. I know. My back has been poor since winter. I'm sorry to hear that. And you're asking me to ride to Calder's Crossing and walk into a building full of criminal men on the word of a 22-year-old woman I met yesterday. Yes, she said. I am. He looked at her. She looked back. Fine, he said. She left his office and went back to the boarding house and sat in the small room and thought about her father. She had been managing this, keeping it in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be processed later because they were too large to process in motion. But she was leaving tomorrow, and she could not afford to encounter it for the first time in the room. Warren Ashcroft. Not the father she'd constructed around the available evidence over 22 years. The incomplete, often absent, fundamentally manageable version she'd worked with. But the actual man, who had looked at his daughter standing on an overturned crate and continued his careful sales pitch, who had spent 5 years building a criminal enterprise on land that belonged to families who had broken ground and built homes, and had recorded every transaction in a ledger with the same meticulous handwriting he used to mark the household accounts. She had thought, once, that the worst thing about her childhood was simply the instability, the gambling debts, the frequent moves before they settled in Calder's Crossing, the years of managing a household that was always slightly short. She had not understood that the instability was a symptom and not the disease, that the disease was something else, something in her father's particular relationship to other people, the way he looked at them and calculated what they were worth to him, what they could be made to do, how they could be converted into a useful number in one of his ledgers. She had been in one of those ledgers too, she supposed, just not one she'd known to look for. She was not going to let that destroy her. She had decided this in the dry wash with Clara Callahan's wagon creaking ahead of her, and she was redeciding it now, because some decisions needed to be made more than once to hold. She was going to walk into that fort, and she was going to face her father, and whatever that felt like, it was going to feel like what it felt like, and she was going to do what needed to be done anyway. She left Millhaven the next morning before full light. She dressed plainly, which was all she had. The same blue dress, cleaned and dried. The knife was in the pocket she'd sewn into the dress's waist, which had been there for years because she was a woman who lived alone with an unreliable father and had long since stopped apologizing for practical modifications to her clothing. The warrant copies Arbuckle had prepared for her were folded inside her jacket. The summary document was with those. The main road from Millhaven to Calder's Crossing took 3.5 hours at a steady pace. She had ridden it enough times to know every turn and grade of it. She rode without hurrying because hurrying would not get her there in time, and she needed to arrive with her head steady and her breathing even. She passed the turnoff for the Canyon Road, then the Henderson property, then the long straight section that ran between two low ridges before dropping into the valley where Calder's Crossing sat. From the ridge's top she could see the town, the main street, the church at the north end, the feed store where 4 days ago she had stood on a crate and tried to locate herself in the specific dark of an experience she hadn't yet understood. She could also see the fort. It sat at the eastern edge of town, low sandstone walls that had been up since before the cavalry arrived and would likely be standing after everyone currently living had concluded their business. It was not large, shaped, built for a company of men, not an army, but it was visible from most of Calder's Crossing, which was why she had chosen it. She could not see Vance. She had not expected to see him. She rode down from the ridge and into the valley. Calder's Crossing was quiet in the way of a place where something is expected to happen. People on the main street moved with slightly more purpose than usual, glanced at her, and then away. She recognized several of them. The woman from the dry goods store, 2 men who worked for Harlan Dodd. Word had traveled. It usually did. She rode directly to the fort without stopping. At the gate, a heavy wooden affair that the cavalry had left intact because it was too heavy to bother removing, she dismounted and tied her horse to the iron ring mounted in the wall, and she straightened her jacket, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she went in. The courtyard inside was approximately 40 feet square, open to the sky, with covered structures along the north and east walls. There were already men inside. She counted before she'd fully processed anything else, because counting was what she did. 14 men visible. Rufus Kane near the center, his hat pushed back, looking at her with an expression that was partway between contempt and something more careful. 3 men she recognized from the original auction. 2 she didn't, who had the look of the proxy men from before. Cheyenne money, which meant Fletcher's people. And her father, against the east wall, in a different vest than the one he'd worn to the auction. His good vest. He was wearing it again. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 22 years. Or perhaps she had seen pieces of it in different configurations and never assembled them into this. The expression of a man encountering something that had not behaved according to his calculations, encountering it in a form he had not anticipated, encountering it in the face of his own daughter. She walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped. "Thank you for coming," she said. She kept her voice the way she'd kept it in Arbuckle's office. Level, deliberate, the voice of a woman who had looked at what she was walking into and had walked in anyway. "You said you had the documents," Kane said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I did say that," she agreed. "I have something better." He looked at her. "What's better than the documents?" "The documents," she said, "plus a judge who's issued warrants in your name and mine, and 8 other men I expect are either in this room or will be shortly." She reached into her jacket and removed the folded papers. "Plus witnesses." The room was very quiet. From the north wall of the fort, from the gap at the foundation level, the one she had dared boys to crawl through when she was 12, there was a sound. Not loud, but in the quiet of the courtyard it was audible. Kane turned toward it, and then there were more sounds. From the east structure, from the door on the courtyard south side, from the shadows along the west wall. Movement, the kind of deliberate movement that Coulter Vance moved with. Not panicked, not theatrical, simply present where he hadn't been a moment before. He was not alone. She did not let herself look for him directly, because that would tell the room something it didn't need to know yet. She kept her eyes on Kane. "You played this well," Kane said. His voice was flat. He was recalculating visibly, the way men did when the room had changed shape around them. "I had good instruction," she said. She thought of the ledger, of Clara Callahan's name on page 47, of Mabel Hennessy's 5 children, and the man who'd ridden through the dark to tell them to run. She thought of her father against the east wall, watching her with that expression she couldn't fully name. She kept her feet on the ground and her voice even and held the warrant papers in her hand, and she waited for what came next. What happened next did not happen in the clean, sequential way that Evelyn had planned it, because nothing involving 14 armed men and a collapsed criminal network ever did. Kane moved first, not toward her, toward the east structure, where one of his men was standing nearest to the door, and he said something low and fast that Evelyn couldn't hear from the center of the courtyard. The man reached for his gun. From the shadow along the west wall came Vance's voice, not raised, carrying across the quiet space the way it always carried. "I wouldn't." The man stopped, but the one beside him didn't. What followed was approximately 4 seconds of chaos that felt considerably longer from inside it, a shot that went into the courtyard wall 10 feet above anyone's head, which Evelyn later understood was deliberate because the man was startled rather than committed. A second shot that came from the east structure and was not deliberate and hit the doorframe. And then Vance moving from the west wall to the center of the courtyard with the specific economy of a man who had calculated the geometry of the space before she'd even arrived, and the 2 men nearest to Kane stepping back because Vance had his gun out and was pointing it with the level steadiness of someone for whom this was not the most tense room he'd ever been in. Evelyn did not move. She had decided, before entering the fort, that if gunfire started, she was not going to run, because running told the room she could be chased, and she was not going to be the woman who could be chased. She stood in the center of the courtyard and held the warrant papers and breathed. "Everybody stop," she said. Her voice came out louder than she expected, loud enough that it cut through the noise in a way that surprised her, and, she thought, surprised several of the men around her. Kane looked at her. He had his hand near his own gun, but not on it, and in his expression was the particular fury of a man who has found himself in a room that has rearranged itself around him and is still deciding what to do about it. "You're outnumbered in a legal proceeding," she said. "Drawing on a judge's warrant officer in front of witnesses is not a calculation that ends well for you. You are a businessman, Mr. Kane. Calculate." The word officer was technically generous. Vance held no official appointment, and she knew it. But in this room, at this moment, the word did work that the facts could not quite do on their own, and she watched it land in the postures of the men around her. Kane's hired men were not ideologues. They were employed. And employed men, when the employment started producing outcomes that were visibly catastrophic, looked for exits. "She's bluffing," said one of the proxy men. Cheyenne voice, precise and uninflected, the same one who had been bidding at the original auction. "I'm not," she said. She held up the warrant papers. "Rufus Kane, Harlan Fletcher, represented here by—" She looked at the proxy man. "I don't know your name." He said nothing. "That's fine," she said. "Judge Arbuckle has your description. The warrant covers agents and representatives of the Consolidated Western Development Company, which is a corporate entity registered in Missouri and operating fraudulently in this territory. She turned slightly. Deputy Harlow. Harlow was at the gate. He had been at the gate since before she'd walked in. She had noticed him when she entered and had cataloged him without letting her face show it. He was not wearing the same expression he'd worn at the original auction, the comfortable expression of a man on the winning side of an arrangement. He was wearing the expression of a man who has watched the ground shift under his feet and is not yet sure where to put his weight. "You received payment from my father," she said. "That's documented in the ledger. The quarterly payments, the initials. Arbuckle has the ledger." She paused. "What you do in the next 2 minutes is going to determine which side of this you end up on." Harlow looked at Kane. Kane looked at Harlow. And in that look, that 3-second communication between a man who had paid and a man who had been paid, Evelyn saw the network unmake itself. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way things actually fell apart, which was through small failures of loyalty, small calculations of personal survival, small moments where the cost of staying aligned exceeded the cost of not. Harlow reached up and unclipped his badge from his shirt. He did not hand it to anyone. He just held it for a moment and then put it in his coat pocket and walked to the east wall and stood there with his arms at his sides, not helping anyone and not impeding anyone. The specific posture of a man who has decided to be a bystander to whatever happens next. Kane said, "Harlow?" "I'm done," Harlow said. Not angry, just tired. The next 40 minutes were not orderly. Arbuckle had come through the south door of the fort at some point during the first 4 seconds. She saw him appear in her peripheral vision and file it away. And now he was moving with the careful deliberateness of a 63-year-old man with a poor back who was executing warrants in a sandstone fort and was clearly not going to let anyone see that he found this stressful. He read the warrants aloud in the manner prescribed by territorial law, which was a specific formal procedure that transformed the document from paper into legal reality, and the reading created a kind of gravity in the room that even the most resistant men had difficulty entirely ignoring. Vance managed the physical side of it with the help of 2 men who had come through the north wall gap behind him. Settlers, Evelyn saw, when she got a clear look at them. Not professional enforcers. A man in farming clothes who moved with the careful discipline of someone who had decided to be useful today and was working hard at it, and a younger man who had a rifle that he held correctly and pointed at the ground, which was the right choice. Claire Callahan was not in the courtyard. Evelyn had not expected her to be. She had told her not to bring the children within 100 yards of the fort, and Clara was not a woman who did the dramatic thing when the practical thing was available. But she had done what she'd been asked, because through the open gate Evelyn could see, at the edge of the street outside, a cluster of people who were not townspeople, families, some with wagons, some on foot, watching. 12 families, she would learn later. Not 35, not all of them, but 12 families who had driven or ridden or walked to this place because a woman they'd never met had sent word through a network of other women and had said, "Your land is in question and you have the right to see it addressed." 12 families standing outside a fort watching the men who had stolen from them be named and documented. It was not the 35 she had wanted. She accepted that. Kane did not go quietly. She had not expected him to. He was the kind of man for whom going quietly was a form of defeat more complete than whatever followed. And so he argued, with Arbuckle, with Vance, and at one point with her directly, in a voice that had shed its public-facing quality entirely and become what she suspected was its actual register, cold, precise, and accustomed to having its way. "You think this ends it," he said. He was standing near the center of the courtyard, Vance 4 feet to his left, Arbuckle 3 feet to his right. He was looking at Evelyn. "It doesn't. Fletcher's attorneys will have this dismissed in a week." "Perhaps," she said. "The Denver court has no jurisdiction over a Missouri corporation." "The Missouri registration is fraudulent," she said. "The company's actual operations have been conducted exclusively in this territory for 4 years. That's jurisdiction." She paused. "Your attorney will know that if he's worth what Fletcher's paying him." Something tightened in Kane's face. "The families lose their land regardless," he said. "Whatever case you make, the transfers are documented in the official registry. Reversing that takes—" "I know how long it takes," she said. I've spoken with Arbuckle, and I've spoken with the families, and they understand the timeline. It will not happen tomorrow. It may take a year. She met his eyes. They know that. They're staying on their land while the legal proceedings run, because the notice of challenge in Millhaven's registry gives them standing to contest any collection attempt during an open dispute. You cannot move on them. She paused one beat. You can try, and you will create additional criminal exposure every time you do. Kane looked at her for a long moment. You're 22 years old, he said. Yes, she said, I am. Your father is standing against that wall, she said, and hasn't spoken in 20 minutes and is not part of this conversation. She had been aware of her father the entire time. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a sound that you're choosing not to turn toward, present in her perception, cataloged, managed. She had known she would have to turn toward it eventually. She had given herself until the immediate crisis was contained. The immediate crisis was not yet fully contained, but it was close enough. Kane looked at Vance. You've been building this for a year. Closer to that, Vance said, and you brought her into it. He didn't say it with particular inflection. He was still calculating, even now. She brought herself, Vance said. Kane made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. Then he looked at Arbuckle. I want my attorney present before I say anything further. That's your right, Arbuckle said. You'll have that opportunity at the county seat. He looked at the farmer in the work clothes, who had a pair of iron cuffs that had been produced from somewhere and was holding them with the self-conscious manner of a man performing an official function for the first time. Go ahead. The proxy men were the harder problem. They had not drawn weapons, had not threatened anyone, had not technically done anything in the fort that constituted a crime, and they knew it. The one with the Cheyenne voice said as much to Arbuckle, with the confident specificity of someone who had seen this kind of proceeding from the legal side before. I'm a representative of a legitimate business entity, he said. I've committed no criminal act in this jurisdiction. The warrant doesn't cover attendance at a meeting. Arbuckle looked at him. No, he said, it doesn't. The man's expression shifted very slightly toward satisfaction. But your name is in that ledger, Evelyn said, and your description is in the affidavit that accompanied Arbuckle's letter to Denver. She looked at him. And the man you represent, Fletcher, is named specifically in the warrant as a co-conspirator, which means that anything you've facilitated on his behalf in this territory is material to a federal investigation. She paused. You can leave this room. That's true, but leaving doesn't remove you from what's already been filed. The satisfaction left his expression. What replaced it was the more careful look of a man doing real arithmetic. I'd suggest, she said, that what you do next, you do with a very good attorney, not Fletcher's attorney, your own. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the other proxy man, who had been silent throughout. Then he walked out through the gate, and the other one followed, and they were gone. Vance watched them go. They'll warn Fletcher. I know, she said. Fletcher's known since the telegram. This doesn't change his knowledge. It changes his options. She paused. Arbuckle's letter to Denver is already sent. Fletcher's attorneys can argue jurisdiction, they can argue procedure, they can delay. But the ledger is real, and his name is in it, and at some point that becomes unarguable. At some point, he said, not disagreeing, acknowledging the gap between now and that point. Yes, she said, at some point. She looked at the east wall. Her father was still there. Isham. The courtyard had emptied of most of its population by the time she walked to where Warren Ashcroft was standing. Arbuckle was near the south door dealing with paperwork in the way that official processes always seem to reduce to paperwork, even in sandstone forts on warm afternoons. Vance was at the gate, watching the street. The farmer in work clothes and the younger man with the rifle had moved to positions near the walls. Her father was watching her come toward him with an expression she had been trying to read for the last 40 minutes and still could not entirely decipher. There was something in it that she recognized, the measuring quality, the calculation, but underneath that something else. Something she might have called unfamiliar on his face, except that she suspected it wasn't unfamiliar. She suspected she had simply never looked for it before, or had looked and not known what she was seeing. She stopped a few feet from him. He did not speak first. That was interesting. Her father had always spoken first. It was one of his strategies, filling the conversational space so that the other person spent their words responding rather than initiating. "You were going to let it go through," she said. Not an accusation, a statement of something she was still, at some level, working to hold as fact. "I thought it was manageable," he said. "The auction. The situation." He shifted his weight. "I thought I had a plan." "You had a plan that involved selling me," she said. "I need you to not soften that." He looked at the ground, then back at her. "Yes." She let that sit between them for a moment. "The ledger," she said. 5 years. 4.5. She almost said something about the precision of that correction and stopped herself. 4.5 years of documented fraud. 19 families initially. 35 or more as it expanded. "I didn't," he started and stopped. "Didn't what?" "I didn't intend for it to expand that way. At the beginning, it was..." He stopped again. He was doing something she'd seen him do rarely, searching for an honest word instead of a strategic one. "At the beginning, it was a transaction, with Cain. I owed him money I didn't have, and he offered me a way to erase the debt by participating in fraud," she said. "Yes." "And then the debt kept being used to keep you participating." He looked at her with something that was recognizably shame, which was not an expression she had often seen on his face and which did not sit naturally on it. "I know what it looks like," he said. "Do you?" "I know what you found in the desk," he said. "I know what you took, and I know..." He paused. "I know that you understand the full scope of it better than most people would, because you're the one who would understand it. You've always been..." He stopped. "What?" she said. "Better at this than me," he said. He said it quietly, without self-pity, in a way that suggested it was something he had known for some time and had not previously acknowledged. "The numbers, the connections, the way you see the structure of a thing." He paused. "I've known that since you were 16. She did not know what to do with this. It was the truest thing he had said to her in a long time, possibly ever. And it was also a kind of compliment that arrived surrounded by everything else he had done, and she couldn't separate those things or pretend one negated the other. "Then why..." she started. "Because knowing something about your child and acting accordingly are different things," he said, "and I was never..." He made a gesture that was, she thought, the most honest gesture she had ever seen him make, both hands open, slightly extended, not reaching for anything. "I was never good at the second one." She stood with that. There was a part of her, the part that had read the ledger by firelight and had kept her father's house and had stood on an overturned crate while men calculated her worth, that had rehearsed this conversation as a confrontation, had wanted it to be a confrontation, with edges and heat and the kind of clarity that comes from fighting. She had thought that would be easier than this slow, uncomfortable unwrapping of something that was not monstrous in a simple way but was instead deeply ordinary in its failures. A man who had done terrible things out of a recognizable weakness, a familiar short-sightedness, an inability to be the person the situation required. He had hurt people. 35 families and herself, and probably others she hadn't counted. That was not diminished by being ordinary. "You're going to be charged," she said. "Arbuckle has the warrants." "I know." "The ledger will be central evidence. Your handwriting is identifiable." "I know," he said again. He didn't argue it, which was the most surprised she'd been by him since this started. "I'm going to testify," she said. "I need you to know that, about what I found and what I understood from it. I'm not going to protect you from the accounting of what you did." He looked at her. For a moment she thought he was going to argue, to recalibrate, to find the angle. Then he said, "I know that too." "Is there anything in the house I missed?" she said. "Any documents? Any connections I didn't find?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a letter," he said. "In the lining of the leather trunk in the bedroom, from Fletcher directly. It names Cain explicitly and a man in the Missouri registration office who processed the fraudulent filing." He paused. "I kept it because I was afraid of Fletcher, because I thought if I ever needed to, if he ever moved against me, I needed something to use." That letter will help the Denver case, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him, at the good vest with its brass buttons, at the hands of a man who hadn't done physical labor in decades and had instead done other things, at the face she had known her whole life and was seeing, today, from a different position than she had ever stood before. I'm not going to forgive you, she said. Not cruelly, just clearly. Not today. I don't know about another time, but not today, and I won't tell you otherwise. He nodded once. But I'm not going to let them use your vulnerabilities to bury this case, she said. If you cooperate with Arbuckle, fully, honestly, that's your best outcome, and it's also what gets the families the clearest path to their land. She paused. I need you to do that. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculating expression was gone. What was under it was harder to look at, not because it was worse, but because it was more human, and she hadn't been prepared for her father to be simply human. All right, he said. She turned and walked back toward Arbuckle. Bum. The afternoon unwound from there in the way that afternoons do after the center of a crisis has passed. Not peacefully, not cleanly, but with the particular exhausted quality of people trying to put a structure back into position after it's been shaken. Arbuckle processed the arrests with the methodical pace of a man who knew the paperwork had to be right, because the paperwork was going to be everything in the weeks ahead. Kane and 2 of his men were formally bound over. Her father was taken separately. Arbuckle had the sensitivity to do that without being asked, which she appreciated. Harlow, who had removed his badge and stood against the wall, was asked to account for his role and gave a statement that was notably detailed in ways that would be useful and that clearly reflected a man who had made his decision and was committed to it now. The families outside the gate did not come in until after the arrests. Then some of them did. Not all, not the ones with young children or the ones who decided that the street was as close as they needed to be. But some. A woman Evelyn didn't know took her hand and held it for a moment without saying anything, which was something Evelyn had not expected and which she did not entirely know how to receive, except to hold still and let it be received. Clara Callahan appeared at the gate with Dub and Iris, Dub having apparently won some argument about proximity during the tense parts, and Iris having decided to supervise his victory. She looked around the courtyard with the expression of a woman taking inventory. Done? She said to Evelyn. The immediate part, Evelyn said. How long for the land? A year, maybe more. She looked at her. I won't tell you otherwise. But Clara made the sound of a woman who has heard worse news and managed it. All right. She looked at the courtyard, at Vance near the gate, at Arbuckle with his papers, at the walls of the fort in the afternoon light. My people will stay, she said. We've stayed through worse than a year of legal proceedings. I know, Evelyn said. Clara nodded. Dub, she said. Stop touching that. Dub, who had been touching an iron ring on the fort wall with exploratory interest, withdrew his hand with the speed of long practice. They walked out of the fort into the late afternoon. Vance was waiting near the horses. They stood there for a moment without speaking, which was something they had gotten comfortable with over the past several days. The particular silence of 2 people who have been in motion together long enough to not need to fill every pause. Evelyn looked at the street of Calder's Crossing, at the families dispersing, at Arbuckle's 2-man escort taking the arrested men toward the county road, at the feed store at the far end of the street where the loading dock was visible, and the empty space where an overturned crate had been 4 days ago. Fletcher's going to move, Vance said. I know. Denver will take time. In the interim, he'll find a procedural argument to delay the land recoveries. I know that too, she said. I've already thought about what the response to that looks like. He looked at her. She had gotten used to the way he looked at her. Not as a calculation, not as an assessment of what she was worth, but as the particular attention of a person who was genuinely trying to understand what another person was saying. She had not had much experience with that, and she was not yet sure how to normalize it. The letter in my father's trunk, she said. It names the Missouri connection. If we can trace the filing back to the source, the corporate structure dissolves. You can't protect land transfers made through a fraudulent corporate entity. The transfers themselves become void. She paused. That's a different argument than reversal. It's faster. You've been working on this since the fort, he said. I've been working on this since Millhaven, she said. I had time in the saddle. He looked at her for another moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not the recalibrating expression. Something different. Something that was closer to the unguarded quality she'd seen when he woke up on the first morning and rubbed his face with both hands. What do you want to do now? He said. She thought about it honestly. Not the strategic answer, not the next step in the proceeding, what she actually wanted. She looked at the town of Calder's Crossing, the valley with its good water and its spring land, the ridge she'd ridden down 2 afternoons ago with the weight of a saddlebag full of evidence. I want to go back to the house, she said. My father's house. Get the letter from the trunk. She paused. And then I want to figure out where I actually live. He looked at her. The house belongs to my father, she said. When the proceedings are done, I don't know what it becomes. I've been maintaining a building that was never mine. I've been keeping accounts for a situation that turned out to be something other than what I understood. She said this without self-pity, just fact. I'm 22 years old and I know how to run a household and understand a ledger and apparently help dismantle a criminal land network. She looked at him. I should be able to convert at least some of that into a life. Probably, he said. Probably, she agreed. They stood there in the late afternoon light of Calder's Crossing, the fort at their backs and the valley spreading out before them, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment had in it all the unresolved things, Fletcher and Denver, and the land cases, and the letter in the trunk, and the 35 families, and the year or more of legal work ahead. And also, somewhere underneath all of that, the simpler thing, the fact of having come through something together. The particular weight of that, which was not nothing, and which neither of them were going to name right now, not today, but which was present in the silence the way the spring was present in the ground of this valley, not visible from where they stood, but the reason everything else grew. The letter was exactly where her father said it would be. She found it that evening, folded inside an oilskin sleeve tucked into the lining of the leather trunk in the bedroom she had kept clean and organized for years as part of the household maintenance she'd performed without knowing the full shape of what she was maintaining. The letter was dated 14 months earlier and written in a hand that was precise and legible and entirely without warmth, the way certain educated men wrote when they wanted every word to be deniable in isolation, but clear in aggregate. Fletcher's name was at the bottom. The name of the Missouri filing agent was in the 3rd paragraph. The instruction to Warren regarding 2 specific land transfers that matched entries in the ledger exactly, was in the 2nd. She read it twice, folded it back into the oilskin, and put it with the other documents. Vance was in the doorway of the bedroom when she turned around. It's what he said it was, she told him. Then we have the Missouri connection. We have it in writing from Fletcher himself, she said, which is better than the ledger because the ledger is my father's record of events. This is Fletcher recording his own instructions. She paused. His attorney is going to have a very difficult time explaining that it means something other than what it says. They rode back to Millhaven that night because staying in Calder's Crossing in her father's house was not something she was prepared to do, and because Arbuckle needed the letter as quickly as possible to add it to the package going to Denver. She was tired in a way that went past the physical, a tiredness that had accumulated across 5 days, and that she was running on past rather than through, the kind that would come due when she finally stopped moving. She was aware of this and kept moving anyway, because the work was not finished, and the part of her that kept accounts knew it. Arbuckle received the letter at his home past 10 at night, in a wool robe and with the expression of a man who had expected this evening to be quieter. He read it at his kitchen table while she and Vance stood, and he made sounds at intervals that suggested he understood its significance. This changes the Denver argument considerably, he said. I know, she said. A fraudulent corporate registration with documented instructions from the registering party. This isn't jurisdictional ambiguity anymore. This is federal mail fraud at minimum, interstate criminal conspiracy at the outside. He set the letter down. Fletcher's attorney is good, but he's not good enough for this. How long? She said. Arbuckle looked at the letter. For Fletcher specifically, the Denver court will move faster once they see this. 3 months for a federal warrant, maybe less if Judge Pierce treats it as urgent. He looked at her. The land reversals are still slower. That's a property proceeding, not a criminal one. You're looking at a year for the cleaner cases. And the complicated ones. Longer, he said. I won't tell you otherwise. I know, she said. I've told the families the same. He looked at her across the kitchen table. In the lamplight, he looked older than he had in his office, or perhaps just more human. A man of 63 who had ridden to a fort that afternoon and executed warrants in a room full of armed men and was now sitting in his wool robe with a letter that would consume the next several months of his professional life. You did something today that required a significant amount of courage, he said. I want to say that plainly, because in the proceedings ahead, nobody is going to say it. They're going to argue about evidence standards and jurisdictional precedents and corporate registration law. Nobody is going to say a 22-year-old woman walked into a room of armed criminals with warrant papers and held the line until the structure fell. She didn't know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being the subject of that kind of direct acknowledgement. Thank you, she said finally. It felt insufficient. It was what she had. He nodded once, the nod of a man who understood it was what she had. Go sleep somewhere, he said. Both of you. The letter isn't going anywhere tonight. She slept 11 hours. When she woke, the boarding house was full of morning light and the sounds of Mill Haven going about its business outside the window. And for just a moment, in the particular confusion of waking in an unfamiliar place, she was not certain where she was or what had led her here. And then she was, completely. She lay still for a while and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the things that had not resolved and would not resolve quickly. Fletcher's federal warrant was 3 months away on a good timeline. The land cases were a year or more. Her father was in the county jail awaiting formal charges, and at some point in that process she would be asked to testify against him in a legal proceeding, which she had told him she would do, and which she intended to do, and which she also understood was going to cost her something she didn't have a word for yet. Not love exactly. She was not sure that word was accurate for what she had felt for her father in recent years, which had been more like vigilant maintenance of a relationship that was always slightly dangerous, something more complicated than love and less simple than its absence. She thought about the creek with the cottonwoods, out past the eastern fence line of a property she no longer had any connection to. The afternoon sitting there with whatever books she could find. She had been a person who did that. She was trying to understand whether that person still existed or whether she had been replaced by this one. The one who read criminal ledgers by firelight and negotiated with judges and stood in the center of a courtyard while men with guns recalculated their positions. She thought they might be the same person. She was not certain yet. She got up. The weeks that followed were administrative in the way that justice, when it functions, is mostly administrative. She stayed in Mill Haven because it was where the work was, helping Arbuckle prepare the evidence package for Denver, providing a formal written account of everything she had witnessed and recovered, sitting with the families who came to the registry office to understand their status, and translating the legal language into the plain kind. This last thing she had not been asked to do. She had simply started doing it because she was there and she could, and the families needed someone who spoke both languages. Claire Callahan came 3 times in the first month. Practical visits, all of them. Specific questions about specific documents, specific concerns about a notice that had arrived from someone claiming to represent the company's Missouri interests. Each time Evelyn walked her through it, and each time Clara left with what she had come for and nothing extra, because that was how Clara operated. On the 3rd visit, before she left, Clara paused at the door of the registry office and said, "You know you don't have to stay in Mill Haven to keep doing this." Evelyn looked at her. "What you're doing with the families," Clara said, "this explaining, this translating." She made a gesture that encompassed the registry office, the papers, the whole apparatus. Calder's Crossing needs someone who can do that. Not for us specifically, just, there's a gap there, and you can see it. Evelyn thought about this after Clara left. She had not gone back to Calder's Crossing since the night she and Vance retrieved the letter. She had told herself this was practical. The work was in Mill Haven, the proceedings were in Mill Haven, but she understood when she was honest with herself that it was also something else, that the town where she had been sold on a dock and had spent 22 years in a house that turned out to be built on fraud was a complicated place to consider returning to, that returning required a version of herself she hadn't yet fully assembled. She thought about what that version would look like, whether it was possible to live in a place as someone other than who you had been there. She did not arrive at an answer quickly. She was not someone who arrived at important answers quickly, which she had come to understand was not a flaw but a feature. The same quality that made her read the ledger twice and check the arithmetic and ask the question she wasn't sure she'd like the answer to. Fletcher's federal warrant came through in 9 weeks, not 3 months. Judge Pierce in Denver, it turned out, had been watching the Consolidated Western Development Company for reasons separate from the Calder's Crossing situation, and the letter from Fletcher to Warren Ashcroft had resolved an evidentiary gap he'd been working around for over a year. He moved quickly. He also, in a letter to Arbuckle that Arbuckle read aloud to Evelyn in his office, used language about the quality of the evidence package that was precise and complimentary and that Arbuckle attributed explicitly to her preparation. He says the summary document was, Arbuckle squinted at the letter, unusually clear for a non-legal submission. Whoever prepared it understood what a court needs to see and provided it without excess. She kept her expression neutral, but she held that sentence in a way she held very few sentences. Fletcher was arrested in Cheyenne on a Tuesday. The Missouri filing agent was taken the following week. Buck Connolly, the deputy U.S. Marshal, whose initials appeared quarterly in her father's ledger, resigned his position the day before a warrant could be formally issued and offered a full accounting of his involvement in exchange for reduced charges, which was the kind of calculation that men like Connolly made when the structure around them dissolved and there was nothing left to shelter under. The land cases, as predicted, took longer. But the fraudulent corporate registration, once proven in federal court, voided the transfer documents at the source. This was Evelyn's argument, the one she had outlined to Vance on the ride back from the fort. Not reversal, but dissolution. The transfers void rather than reversed, which was a different legal posture with a faster resolution timeline. Arbuckle's colleague in Denver made the argument formally. The first families had their land restored in 11 months. The last of the 37, there were 37 in the end, 2 more than she had estimated, were cleared in 14. She was not there for all of it. She was there for some of it. Her father's sentencing was in the spring, 8 months after the fort. She testified for 2 hours. She was accurate and complete, and she did not protect him, and she did not perform cruelty toward him either, which was harder than it might have seemed because the room wanted one or the other. Wanted either a grieving daughter who made the crime seem less, or an avenging one who made the drama easier to consume. She was neither. She gave the court what she had given Arbuckle: clear lines, clear connections, the arithmetic of what had happened without editorial. Warren Ashcroft received a sentence of 4 years, reduced from a potential 8 for his cooperation with the federal investigation. He stood for the sentencing with the careful stillness of a man who had run out of angles and had reached some understanding with that fact. He looked at her once, when it was over. Not the measuring look and not the shame look from the fort, but something quieter than either. Something that might have been, under different circumstances and in a different life, the look of a man who was simply her father. She held it for a moment. Then she walked out of the courtroom into the spring light. She stood on the courthouse steps for a while. The air smelled of thaw and mud, and somewhere, at the edge of it, the particular green smell of things starting again. She was 23 years old. She had been 22 when she stood on an overturned crate in a feed store dock and looked at a rope on a far wall and tried to hold on to herself. That was less than a year ago, and also much longer than that, in the way that certain kinds of time work. Vance was at the bottom of the steps. He had been in and out of her life in these 8 months the way he was in and out of everything, present when the work required it, absent when it didn't, never explaining his movements in advance, and never failing to appear when she needed him to appear, which she had decided was either a remarkable coincidence or a form of attention she hadn't yet found the right vocabulary for. "How was it?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Accurate." She came down the steps. "The sentence is fair, I think, given the cooperation. Do you feel it's fair?" She thought about that honestly. "I feel it's what the situation produced," she said. "I'm not sure my feelings about it are finished yet." He nodded. He didn't push past that, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without meaning to. The way he accepted that some things needed more time than a conversation and didn't require them to be resolved on his schedule. I'm going back to Calder's Crossing, she said. He looked at her. Clara was right, she said. There's a gap there. The families who stayed, and most of them stayed, they need someone who understands the ongoing legal proceedings and can help them navigate what comes next. The land restorations are still processing. There will be challenges, appeals, men like Fletcher who lose at the federal level and try again at the territorial. Someone needs to be there who can read those moves when they come. You, he said. Apparently, she said. I've been running accounting for other people's lives my whole life. I'd like to try running it for something I believe in. He was quiet for a moment. There's also the house, she said. My father's house. The court has placed it in temporary receivership pending the proceedings. I've been informed that as his only family member with no criminal involvement, I have standing to petition for it. She paused. I've thought about that for a while, about whether I want to live in a house I grew up in and didn't know the real shape of. What did you decide? I decided that the house is made of wood and stone, she said. What I do in it is what it becomes. She looked at him. That might be naive. No, he said, it's not. He said it simply, without the hedging she might have expected from a man who was usually careful about what he committed to. She looked at the spring light on the courthouse facade. She thought about 37 families in 11 months and a legal argument she'd outlined on a horse in a dry wash. She thought about a creek with cottonwoods that was still out there, past the eastern fence line of a property that might soon be hers to decide what to do with. She thought about the woman on the dock who had looked at a rope on a far wall and had held herself together by remembering she was a person who read books and did arithmetic and knew the specific dark of a house well enough to move through it without light. That woman had not been defeated by what happened to her. She had been refined was not the right word. It was too clean. She had been revealed, maybe. Circumstances had stripped away the surface of a situation she'd been managing and shown her what was underneath. And what was underneath was someone with more capacity than she had been given room to use. That was not an easy thing to be grateful for. She was working on it. Come with me, she said. Vance looked at her. To Calder's Crossing, she said. Not permanently, if that's not what you want, but there are men who are going to challenge the land restorations when they come through, and I will need someone who knows how they operate and how to operate in return. She paused. And I would rather not go back to that town alone. He was quiet in the way that was not hesitation, but consideration, the genuine kind, the kind that arrived at real answers instead of convenient ones. I'll need to finish something north of here first, he said. There's a matter in Pete. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to stop being what you are. He looked at her. The courthouse steps were quiet around them. Somewhere in the town, a wagon was moving over cobblestones, the ordinary rhythm of a place with its own business to attend to. 3 weeks, he said. I'll be there, she said. She arrived in Calder's Crossing on a Wednesday afternoon in early May, on the same roan horse she'd ridden out of this valley 8 months earlier. The town looked the same and different in the way that places look when you are looking at them differently. The same buildings, the same main street, the same fort at the eastern edge with its sandstone walls catching the light. But she was riding in from a different direction than she had left, and that changed the angle of everything. The feed store was open. Harlan Dodd's brother Marsh was sweeping the front step, and he looked up when she rode past and looked down again without anything in his expression. She did not know what to make of that, and decided it was not yet her problem. The house was as she'd left it. The receivership had put a notice on the door that she removed with the practical efficiency of a woman who had already spoken to the court's administrator and understood exactly what her standing was and what it permitted. Inside, the air was stale and cold with months of closure, and the particular absence of habitation had settled into everything the way it does when a house goes unoccupied. A slight dimness, a stillness that was not peaceful but vacant. She opened the windows. It took a week to make the house livable again, which she did herself, and during that week the families came. Not all of them, and not all at once. Clara first, with Dub and Iris, ostensibly to drop off some dried goods and clearly also to assess. Then Mabel Hennessy, who had met her exactly once in a courtyard, in the middle of a crisis. and who came now with a composure that told Evelyn the woman had survived the last 8 months on the same thing Evelyn had: the discipline of not allowing panic to be more than a temporary condition. Then others, a man named Renner, who had the second largest claim of the restored families and who wanted to understand the appeals process in direct, concrete terms, which she provided. A young couple who had arrived from Colorado the previous fall and discovered, on getting to the registry, that the land they'd been planning to claim had been part of the fraudulent transfers and was currently in the middle of a restoration proceeding. Complicated, not yet resolved, but not hopeless. She made no promises she couldn't keep. She did not present herself as something she was not. She was 23 years old with a talent for reading complicated documents and translating them into plain language, and she had some recent experience with the specific network of criminal enterprise that had operated in this valley, and she was willing to do the work of showing up. That was what she had. She offered it. The work was slow and frequently frustrating, and the legal system did not move on her timeline or anyone else's. And there were days when she sat at the desk in what had been her father's study and looked at the walls and felt the weight of the work ahead and the inadequacy of one person's capacity against the complexity of what 37 families needed. On those days, she went to the creek with the cottonwoods, which was still there, and sat for a while without solving anything, and then came back. She had learned, in this year, that you did not have to solve everything before you were allowed to rest, that the work continued after you set it down for an evening, that the files remained on the desk, and the families remained on their land, and the proceedings moved at the pace they moved, and none of that required her to be in motion every hour of every day. This had taken longer to learn than she expected, given that she had always been the one who kept things running, and the adjustment was not complete yet. But she was working on it. Vance arrived 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, as he had said he would. He came from the north, which was where he generally came from. He tied his horse at the front of the house that was now her house and knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he was holding his hat and looking at her with the gray eyes that saw things accurately and had, from the beginning, from the first moment in that feed store dock, seen her the same way he saw everything else. Not as a commodity, not as a problem to be managed, not as a woman in a situation requiring rescue, as a person doing the best she could with what she had, which was all any of them were doing, and which was enough. "You said 3 weeks," she said. "I said 3 weeks. You're on time. I try to be." She stepped back and let him in. That was not an ending exactly. It was not a clean resolution with all the edges matched and all the accounts balanced. Fletcher's legal team filed 2 additional challenges over the following year, and Evelyn worked both of them with Arbuckle's support and won one and reached a settlement on the other that was not ideal, but was workable. 3 of the 37 families eventually sold their land and left, which was their right and which she did not judge, because this valley had cost them things that some people didn't recover from, and that was simply true. Clara Callahan did not sell. Mabel Hennessy did not sell. Most of them did not sell. Warren Ashcroft served 3 of his 4 years and was released quietly and moved east, and Evelyn learned of this through a letter forwarded by the county administrator. She read it once and put it in a drawer. She did not know yet what she would do with that knowledge. She left it in the drawer and let it wait. The house became her house fully and over time. She learned what it was when she was the one who decided what happened in it, and what it was turned out to be something she could live in. Not because the history left or because the complicated feelings resolved themselves into something tidier, but because she was there every day, doing what she did, and the house took the shape of that. It was not a story about triumph or clean breaks or the satisfying click of things falling into place. It was a story about a woman who was put on a crate and decided, in the time it took a frightened stranger to ride through a back door, that she was not going to be defined by the place where someone else had put her, who took the ledger and the letters and the evidence of what had been done and converted it, through months of slow and imperfect work, into something that could stand in front of a judge and mean something. She had been afraid for most of it. She had been uncertain for most of it. She had made at least 3 decisions that could have gone badly, and had not gone badly for reasons that were partly her own doing and partly luck, and she was honest with herself about which was which. There was no version of this story where everything worked out right on the first try. There was only the version where you kept the documents and opened the desk and rode east into the dark and trusted that the next step would be visible when you needed to take it. She had taken it. That was what she knew. The valley in the mornings was quiet and wide, and the spring ran clean through the eastern edge of the property, and the cottonwoods were there, the same as they had always been. She went to work.